Reconstruction was a time in American history that drew and continues to draw both contempt and anger from many Americans. To some, particularly within the South, it was an oppressive policy which went too far and amounted to a decade-long military occupation of the former Confederacy by the North. But for others, there was and perhaps still is a belief that it did not go far enough and allowed the South to continue practices oppressive to its black population. The cause for this discontent was that the policy was repeatedly reworked and fumbled, as it changed hands many times, from Lincoln's wartime Reconstruction to Johnson's presidential Reconstruction to the later Radical Reconstruction of Congress. Regardless of perspective, Reconstruction was a failure and only succeeded in deepening cultural and ideological divides within the United States. One of the most radical groups involved in the process of Southern Reconstruction was the Radical Republicans, who desired to completely change the South on a fundamental level, with their policies more focused on vengeance than reconciliation. Their desire for their form of Reconstruction went so far that they even resisted and attempted to impeach Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, after they gained a supermajority by leveraging the death of Lincoln to gain support from more vindictive Northerners. However, Johnson, before he was eventually forced to step down, was able to get through a number of policy positions that led many Southerners to expect reconciliation and in addition hindered the later efforts of the Radical Reconstruction. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, the Radical Reconstruction was fully enacted? Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another alternate history scenario for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome and stay tuned. Before we go any further, I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who's donated to us on Patreon, Utreon, and right here on YouTube through channel memberships. Your donations really go a long way to keeping this channel going, and by donating to us across any of these platforms, you'll get access to some great perks including physical merch, a custom designed flag wallpaper, and access to an exclusive members-only Discord server where you can enter your scenarios for a chance to have them made into full videos. You can follow the pop-up on screen here, or go to the comment section or description to visit any of these pages and support our channel, and of course you can do so by clicking the join button right below this video. If you can't donate anything, consider subscribing and sharing this video to help the channel out. Now, back to the video. Even before the end of the Civil War, there were already many different theories on how the Union government would treat the South following the war. Moderate Republicans such as Lincoln proposed reconciliation as the primary goal, seeing Southerners not as enemies but as misguided brothers who needed assistance. However, there were also the Radicals who had several other plans for what should be done with the South, whether it be the instantaneous enfranchisement of the now 4 million freedmen or the occupation of and redrawing of state lines in the South as vengeance for their secession. During the Civil War, Lincoln being president still held the most influence over the initial phase of Reconstruction known as wartime Reconstruction. It was during this time that Lincoln gave several orders and proclamations in the final years of the war. This included the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all slaves in the rebelling southern states. Another critical part of wartime Reconstruction was the 10% Plan, which proposed that all states before their readmission to the Union have 10% of their population give an oath of loyalty to the Union beforehand. Even with Lincoln being the glue that held the nation together, divides began to appear as Radical Republicans attempted to pass a bill that would expand the requirement to 50% of the white male population. However, even though this would be passed by Congress, Lincoln would pocket veto it, viewing it as far too demanding a measure that would only lead to more division after the Civil War. Still, even while the Radicals were unable to make any legislative change, their influence could still be felt in many areas that the Union had occupied near the end of the war, such as General Sherman's confiscation of 400,000 acres of land in Georgia and South Carolina, which he redistributed to the new population of freemen. The war would draw to a close on April 9th of 1865 when the Confederacy surrendered, and while many saw this as a chance to heal a broken nation, there were those who sought revenge for the Union's victory over the South. One of these men was John Wilkes Booth, who had grown up in Maryland, a border state between the traditional North and Confederate South. Despite this, Booth had identified more so with the South. Booth had in this time become a strong supporter of the slave system and an anti-abolitionist. However, while his sympathies for the Confederacy were strong, he promised his mother that he would not fight for them, and so remained in Maryland during the war, where his sentiments only stewed further, soon leading him to consider conspiracy against the Union. Initially, he and a group of Confederate sympathizers had planned to kidnap Lincoln in early 1865 and hold him hostage in an attempt to bargain his life for Confederate independence. However, this plan ultimately fell through and never amounted to much. Booth would once again begin plotting after hearing tell of the Confederate surrender, and so he, along with 2 other co-conspirators, planned to assassinate not just Lincoln but his Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward. On the day of the plot, April 14, 1865, only 6 days after the Confederate surrender, the plan would be put into motion. However, things did not go according to plan. Johnson's would-be assassin wound up not following through with his attack. Meanwhile, the assassin for Seward had succeeded in attacking him, but failed to kill him. The one part of the plan which did succeed was John Wilkes Booth's part in it, where he successfully shot and mortally wounded Abraham Lincoln in Ford's Theater. More than just Lincoln's death, it would be Johnson's ascension to the presidency and the subsequent rise in radical republicanism which would set the stage for the turbulent remainder of Reconstruction. Johnson, while a Democrat, was a moderate and had hoped to continue Lincoln's policies of moderate Reconstruction, and upon assuming office set about his efforts to both reconcile with the South, yet still set about abolishing slavery as a compromise with the Radicals. This began what became known as Presidential Reconstruction, where Johnson set up provisional state governments even as the South remained under continued military occupation. In addition to this, Johnson also began a policy that allowed Southerners to reclaim confiscated property with the exception of their slaves, which brought about an end to Sherman's land redistribution project. Demobilization was also a large part of Johnson's Reconstruction policy as he sought to decrease military tensions within the South. As a part of this, he would declare an official end to the war on August 20th of 1866 in all states aside from Texas, which hadn't established a new state government at that point. Johnson during his term had supported the 13th Amendment, which fully ended the practice of slavery in the United States, with the expressed exception of forced labor as punishment. But with Lincoln's assassination, the Radical Republicans were able to leverage his death to gain widespread support from a now vindictive North. This allowed them to gain a supermajority within both the House and Senate, allowing them to override vetoes by Johnson. This came to a head when Johnson faced impeachment by the House, who had justified this on account of an early removal of the at-the-time Secretary of War. Johnson would be impeached but managed to remain in office. However, his reputation took a massive hit and he didn't actively seek a second term for office, spending the remainder of his term extending amnesty to nearly all former Confederates. With near absolute control following what amounted to a character assassination of Johnson, the Radical Republicans would pass the Reconstruction Act of 1876, which divided the entire former Confederacy aside from Tennessee into 5 military districts. In addition to this, it also required all former Confederate states to write new constitutions that would include the 13th and even the yet-to-be-passed 14th Amendments. In the ensuing election of 1868, former Union General Ulysses S. Grant won a resounding victory by a total of 300,000 popular votes and 134 electoral votes. Grant had formerly cooperated with Johnson, however, since the attempted removal of him from office, Grant had broken with him and sided more with the Radical Republicans. Grant would go about furthering the interests of the Radical Republicans with the 14th and 15th Amendments being passed in the early days of his presidency, which granted citizenship to the population of freedmen, created the Equal Protection Clause, and lastly banned voter discrimination over race. Throughout the remainder of Grant's administration, other such similar acts would be enacted, with the most prominent being the 1875 Civil Rights Act, which banned all forms of discrimination in public places, later being overturned by the Supreme Court. Reconstruction would come to an end with the election of 1876, when the state votes of South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana came back inconclusive. This resulted in a contested election with the potential for a new civil war to break out over it. However, Republican and Democrat lawmakers met and agreed to give the presidency to the Republican candidate in exchange for an end to the occupation and most Reconstruction-era policy. As stated before, the Reconstruction failed. It failed to rebuild the South as the Southerners had hoped, it failed to provide equality to freedmen as the Radicals had hoped, and it failed to reconcile and reunite the country as the Moderates had hoped. But this time, things are different. In our own timeline, neither side managed to fully implement their desired goals due to Lincoln's death and Johnson's administration. The ideal point of divergence for a radical Reconstruction to be implemented would be for the entirety of the Booth assassination plot to have succeeded, as this would have prevented Johnson from slowing down radical Reconstruction efforts. For the sake of this scenario, let's now consider that the assassination conspiracy succeeded as it was originally planned, with both Johnson and Seward being assassinated alongside Lincoln. The immediate effects of this would be felt throughout the nation. The 3 most important executive officials would be dead, and the country would be desperately left in the aftermath of a war without direction. This could potentially inspire acts of continuing resistance from the southern states, especially in the state of Texas, where in our own timeline some Confederate soldiers continued to resist the Union, and where a number of Confederate soldiers in our own timeline had fled. On the other hand, this may also inspire more confiscations and crackdowns on the southern population, since now the executive office was left vacant with no one to prevent occupying generals such as Sherman from confiscating land or increasing their presence in the towns and cities throughout the South. No clear line of succession would have been established at this point, as it was only after the 25th Amendment passed a little under a century later that any clear line of succession beyond the vice presidency was made. In the chaos that would follow, Schuyler Colfax, the radical Republican Speaker of the House, would most likely be chosen to serve as an interim president by Congress, as while a line hadn't been established, the Speaker would be among the highest-ranking elected officials in the United States, giving the Radicals an opportunity to seize control of the presidency. With the assassination as impetus, Colfax and other radical Republicans would go about implementing the Radical Reconstruction plan in full. However, the form it would take on in this world would likely be far more extreme than the Radical Reconstruction experienced in our timeline, as the death of Lincoln would be fresh in the minds of many. This more extreme form of Radical Reconstruction would almost certainly be influenced by a little-known but still influential theory known as state suicide. What it propounded was that by seceding from the Union, the states that did had committed suicide and so reverted back to the status of territories. In our own timeline, state suicide theory had been partially implemented following Lincoln's death, with it being used to justify the temporary exclusion of Southern representatives from Congress. However, in this timeline with a radical Republican in power, it's likely that the full extent of this theory would be adopted. There would be no major demobilization, and instead the South would remain under full permanent occupation instead of the reduced occupation it faced in our timeline. Meanwhile, the role of the Freedmen's Bureau would be expanded, with Sherman's original confiscation of land being used as a model throughout many areas of the South to redistribute land to the freed population. With this, the black population of the South would be rewarded largely at the white population's expense, including those who had been against secession. This would be where a lesser-known component of state suicide theory would come into play, the theory that Congress could redraw the borders of the state since they had given up their rights. Even in our own timeline, we had seen several proposals for the division of Texas that were put forward throughout the Reconstruction era, dividing it into 2 or even 3 states. In this alternate timeline, it could be assumed that Texas would be divided as it would likely see continued rebel activity as it had in our timeline. This would lead to the creation of the states of Trinity and Lincoln, carved out of lands east of the Trinity River and south of the Colorado River respectively. Meanwhile, the West may be sold to the federal government as had been proposed by radical Republican Texans. The territory in question would extend west of a line running from where the Pecos River met the Rio Grande to the northwest corner of Hardman County. This would leave only a small area to the north of the Colorado, west of the Trinity, and east of the Pico-Hardman line to be what remained of Texas. With the radical Republicans holding the presidency, Colfax likely remaining president for a second term, and the radicals certainly gaining a supermajority in both chambers of Congress by the election of 1866 as they had in our world, they would redraw state lines to create states for the whites who were against secession so that they would not be subject to any sort of reparations that would be enacted under the timeline's 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These new states would likely be concentrated primarily in Appalachia and the upland South. The first of these new states would be carved out of eastern Tennessee, probably taking the name of Franklin, that of an earlier proposed state. Northern Alabama and Georgia would also be merged into a new state that may choose to name itself Appalachia, given that aside from the wider population and lower development, the foothills of the Appalachians would be one of the few distinguishing features from its lowland counterparts. The state which would see the most significant loss of territory aside from Texas, of course, would be Virginia, which would likely see much of its land in the Shenandoah Valley, which in our own timeline voted against secession, incorporated into the state of West Virginia, which had already constituted a significant loss of land for Virginia. Lastly, the radical Republicans may also transfer the Virginia-owned portion of the Delmarva Peninsula to the state of Maryland and re-annex Alexandria into the District of Columbia to further reduce the state's power. Another motive behind redrawing the states would be the effort to create majority black states to prevent pro-Confederate whites or their descendants in those states from regaining power and oppressing the black population. From this, we could expect several majority black states to emerge. One of these states would be in eastern North Carolina, which had a significant higher black population than its western counterpart. The largest of these potential states would be one created by merging several majority black regions from southwestern Georgia, western Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi. With this redrawing of the states, it becomes almost assured that it would be impossible, at least for a time, for the governments in much of the South to impose any form of black codes or other such segregation measures. Given the effects of this, it could be expected that in many of the black majority states, significant populations of white Southerners may move to regions in the American Great Plains, Southwest, or Cascades, especially with the sting of the Civil War still hot and with some of them not even able to return to their potentially confiscated property. By the time of the next presidential election, the radical Republicans could be expected to muster a victory regardless of whichever candidate they chose to run, as the only citizens of the South remaining enfranchised would be pro-Union whites and blacks. Regardless of this victory, pro-Confederate rebels remaining in the South would likely continue their activities, possibly resorting to terrorist and anti-federal guerrilla tactics. It would be around this time, with Civil War tensions having cooled slightly, that Reconstruction may finally be challenged in the Supreme Court as the constitutionality of state suicide theory would come into question. The Supreme Court, having a pro-Democrat, pro-moderate tilt, may attempt to overrule the actions taken by Congress and the executive branch in Reconstruction. However, Congress would likely respond aggressively to any attempts at ending radical Reconstruction, most notably by expanding the number of Supreme Court seats and quickly filling them with radical nominees. There was a precedent for this, as in our own timeline, Lincoln added an additional justice to the Supreme Court to prevent it from interfering in the war. Meanwhile, among Southern whites, the Democrat Party or an alternative successor party would almost certainly see a resurgence, given how the Southern white population had been and continued to be treated by the federal government. This would lead to a later backlash, much like in our own timeline, by the middle or more likely late 1870s, when critics of Reconstruction became significantly more vocal of their opposition. At this time, it's also important to keep in mind that while many Northerners were against slavery, there was a significant divide over the population of freedmen. Among Northerners, there were strong pro-segregation sentiments, with many states having laws against interracial marriage and sharing of public spaces. But with segregation being outlawed by the Constitution, other workarounds would likely be found, furthering the debate into the far future. This divide may even potentially lead the Republican Party to split over the issue of segregation, with the Radicals remaining the party heads while those in favor of limited pro-segregation policies, mostly moderate, split off and formed a new party. This new party may also draw in enfranchised Southerners, given that most political office holders from the former Confederacy would be barred. However, some Southern whites may refuse to support this new party given lingering embitterment toward the North for its policies, possibly preventing the two parties from working together for a few decades. As we advance further into this timeline, specific events become murkier, but a few trends would likely emerge. First, the United States may become more socialist. This is because with the United States in this timeline having implemented land redistribution policies after the Civil War, it can be expected that the black and lower class white populations would be more sympathetic towards socialist ideals, especially as the US continued to enter early industrialization. An additional side effect of these land redistribution policies in the United States would be a number of small family-style African-ran farms in the South, as opposed to our own timeline, which generally saw a number of large farms maintain their grip through a system of sharecropping and other practices. Why this is worth mentioning is that it may create a divide between rural landowning blacks and urban Southern blacks over economics. Secondly, the United States would be far more racially divided. In our timeline, discriminatory policies such as those of the Black Codes and Jim Crow led many African Americans to move to northern cities, hence why there are significant African populations in the urban North today. In this alternate timeline, without these policies being enacted in the several now majority black states of the South, the black population would have less incentive to move north, making the North a far less racially diverse area. Third and finally, the United States would be far less stable. Due to the previous factors discussed, the United States would see greater social and political instability, as with greater racial divisions along geographic lines and a more heavy-handed federal government, the United States could see more activity from secessionist elements and discontent populations. In our own timeline, the system of federalism after the Civil War allowed for a relative coexistence between the North and South, as states still controlled significant amounts of local policy. However, in this timeline it would likely be less so, given that the federal government would have set about completely redrawing half of the country during this timeline's Reconstruction. This would all increase the likelihood that the United States would not remain united in the long term, as while the radical Republicans may have been able to enforce their will during Reconstruction, it would have simply allowed the hatred and anger of old to continue to brew. But what do you think? What might have happened had the Radical Reconstruction been fully enacted? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Mr. Z, out.